And then iOS loading. The Bootstrap finds the correct configuration register and tells the router to load the first iOS file located in flash memory. So the located file is decompressed, then loaded into RAM. At this point, the iOS should be loaded and starts running. So, you know, it goes through all that. You've gone through Post, you've gone through Bootstrap, you haven't been forced to ROM on for any reason. It's located the iOS file and it loads it up and starts running it in RAM. So at this point, you've gotten all the way up through the actual iOS. The operating system of the router is loaded properly. So you go to the configuration loading. Once the iOS is loaded, the router searches for the startup-config in NVRAM. If there is a config available, it loads the config into RAM as the running config. So this again goes back to what we just talked about in the last little section. You know, you've got multiple spots in memory. RAM is volatile. You've got your iOS loaded there, and now you've got your running config loaded there as well. That way you don't risk the chance of corrupting either your startup config or the iOS saved in flash. If there is no startup config or it cannot locate one, it will try to download one via TFTP. If TFTP is not accessible, it will enter setup mode. And setup mode, you guys have seen this if you've configured a router before, especially from scratch. This is a set of questions the router asks to try to set up a basic config. It is this is kind of my opinion, but it is geared for the technically less technically savvy. I would never ever recommend using setup mode. Like it's basically like a dummy set of questions that the router will go through to try to give you some basic connectivity. But if you've got a config already prepared that you're going to load in there, or you really have any idea like what you're doing inside of a Cisco router, I would never recommend going into setup mode. So you'll get the command or the dialog asking you, would you like to enter the initial configuration dialog? Yes or no? Always select no. And if you've got a technician on site that's loading a new config, make sure that he knows to select no and doesn't just hit enter or hit Y whenever that comes up. Otherwise, you're probably going to have to right erase the box again and reload it again to make sure that you've got a completely fresh config to load in there. And actually, I'm going to take a step back for a second before we go into password recovery. And where did I put it? Okay, so I got this this guy from supply chain last week, and from their bad routers pile, so we'll see how well it works. And then supply chain was also nice enough to loan me this adapter since I could not locate mine, and I don't have a serial port on mine. And it's going to be I should actually run you guys through Hyperterm. I don't have it on this computer since they stopped installing Hyperterm on the newer PCs because they want money for it now. But a lot of times you'll have to walk a technician through connecting this. But the main thing you need to make sure is you got the right COM port. In my case, it installed this as COM4, so that's why I'm selecting it. And then the standard speed for a Cisco router that has not been reconfigured otherwise is going to be 9600. And it is important we power it on.
That helps. I don't get to see the window.
Well, that's what I want to try to catch. And last time it didn't do it. It just let me in when it got to the setup mode. But okay, so yeah, here we go. We can see it. And it's going to start running a series of tests. Probably finishing up Post right now. Okay, so Post is finished. It's located the iOS in Flash, so it's booting that iOS file from Flash to RAM.
Thank you, sir. Much obliged.
Yeah, it's much better. I can actually read it now.
Okay, iOS is loaded. And wait for it to see if it can find the configuration, which this is a defaulted router, so it should not be able to find a configuration. Take a long time, depending on like I said, this router may very well be suspect because it's just been sitting back there. It was in the junk routers pile, so presumably something is wrong with it. But depending on like what model of router you've got and how old it is, that kind of thing, you know, the boot up process, even if it's got a config loaded in there, might just take a second. It might take a few minutes. But like at this point, I think if I hit enter, it'll probably ask me the initials. Oh, nope, there it goes.
Oh.
Okay, so I actually hit enter. I guess you do actually have to type yes, so that's good. So this is what we just talked about, the setup mode, system configuration dialog. Would you like to enter the initial configuration dialog? Never. I don't think it'll let me put never, so we'll just type no or in. Hit enter. Press return to get started. And it's all that stuff you're seeing is like interfaces going up or down. You know, it's verifying the status of those interfaces. All of them should be down since it has no configuration. Once it gets through with that, hit enter, and I've got the router greater than sign. If you've got a router that's completely defaulted, it should always have a host name of router. And we'll actually kind of, I think it's the next section, we'll get into the various modes. But actually, let me just go back here before we go any further on that. Okay, so that's it booting correctly. Password recovery, if you're locked from the router because a password is unknown, you can alter the configuration register to 0 by 2142. 02142 instructs the router to ignore the startup config. So you'll still load the iOS. You won't get stuck in ROM-mon or anything like that, but it won't boot. It won't load whatever configuration it would normally load. Once in the router, you can clear the startup config or possibly decrypt the password depending on the configuration. So, you know, if let's say this is the router let's say we did that with the router that we're loading. Let's go back. You know, this router, let's say that we were doing that with this router, that this does have a startup configuration on it, and we had just changed the configuration to 2142. If we were to jump into enable mode, we could still do a erase start, and it would delete whatever was whatever was currently in the NVRAM. So we don't actually need to do that, so we'll cancel out. And then the other thing you can do is, if there was a startup configuration in here, you could do a show start. And since it's not there, it's not going to show anything. But if this was a completely configured router, we could grab that startup config, look for where the password would be located, and depending on like how they had configured the router, we might actually be able to pull the lines that have the username and password, decrypt those, and be able to get back into this router after changing the configuration register back to 2102, of course. Get into this router and get in with the password without having to like default the router. So that's like kind of a neat little trick if you're ever stuck, have a tech on site and you don't want to worry about like trying to reconfigure. You know you've got a good config, but you just don't have the password.
What's the break to stop it from loading?
To stop the
config, is it F2?
No, it's like control break.
Yeah, control break, I think.
And then that's what you can do that. And then like
no, dump you right into ROM-mon mode.
Yeah, and then from ROM-mon mode you can change the configuration registry.
Now, once you've changed the configuration registry, and you said you could pull the config, you could do like a show startup.
Yeah, you just do just like I did right there, show start or show start dash config, and it's going to output whatever saved and started. Just didn't load it because you've set the configuration register for it not to load it.
Can you also, if you need to, TFTP the config somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, you could like TFTP it back to you so you could look at the config, but if you've got access to it like this would be, you would have to have a tech on site to do this or have the router right in front of you. You wouldn't be able to not have it load the config and still be able to get in the router because it's not going to come up with a WAN configuration. So you could try to TFTP it back as well. And once again, I'll say it one more time. If you do this, make sure you change the register back to 2102. That way it doesn't just keep booting and not loading the config. I've actually seen on a few dispatches where we've had a technician out there that he kept loading the config in there, and he knew he was doing it right. We weren't getting any errors, and every time he loaded it back up, he got back to the router side. It didn't have any config in there, and it was because whoever set it in the past had set the configuration register to 2142. So keep that in mind if you're ever working with a tech and it just won't save the configuration.